My name is Gordon Scruton, and I'm the Learning Development Tutor for ICJS. This presentation is intended to provide you with a few general tips on the process of writing. We'll first consider the advice on writing that has come from these various great minds from the past and present. In many cases, these people were not necessarily talking specifically about academic writing, but when it comes to the process of writing, good advice is good advice. So we start with E.M. Forster, author of Room with a View, Howard's End, and Passage to India. This quote is from his 1927 book, Aspects of the Novel. How do I know what I think until I see what I say? You might need to take a moment to think about this. How do I know what I think until I see what I say? I've chosen this quote to start us off with because it, quite rightly I think, establishes the connection between thinking and writing. Writing is thinking. Stephen King put it another way when he said, writing is refined thinking. If your master's thesis is no more organized than a high school essay, you're in big trouble. And most study skills books discussing academic writing will also allude to this writing equals thinking idea. Forster here is talking about the process of writing and not the product of writing. For you, as a university student, the product of writing will be what you submit for assessment. But it is important to remember that there is another type of writing we shouldn't ignore. The writing that is your thinking. Forster is saying that he needs to write his thoughts down before he becomes fully aware of them. So why is this important? Well, it takes the pressure off you to see what you write as some sort of finished product that must be perfect immediately. Think about how this applies in your work life. Do you do all your thinking and only then commit a perfect product to paper or to the screen? Most of us don't write an email this way. Instead, we construct it as we write it. So from Forster, we now move to this quote from Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of The Scarlet Letter, who very simply tells us that easy reading is damn hard writing. So if you find a text particularly easy or enjoyable to read, then it's almost certain that the author had to work very hard to make it that way. From a student perspective, the more work a reader needs to do to understand, the fewer marks they will give you. So if what Forster was telling us is that the first draft is for you, then what Hawthorne is telling us is that you need to write many subsequent drafts for your audience. This is an important idea to keep in mind. Audience. How much do you consider the reader when you've written reports at work, for example? Let's consider these next two quotes, which I've put together because I feel they both speak about the same thing. The first one is from noted German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who stated that those who know they are profound strive for clarity. Those who would like to seem profound strive for obscurity. This connects with a lot of student struggles and misgivings that if one is writing at university level, one must write in a very complicated and confusing way. A more humorous example of this comes in the form of a Calvin and Hobbes sketch, with Calvin explaining, "I used to hate writing assignments, but now I enjoy them. I realized that the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. With little practice, writing can be an intimidating and impenetrable fog." At this point, Hobbes reads the title of Calvin's work, The Dynamics of Interbeing and Monological Imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study in psychic transrelational gender modes. And then Calvin concludes by saying, "Academia, here I come." Returning to Nietzsche's quote, and from what Calvin and Hobbes so wonderfully parody, we have to address a bit of an elephant in the room here. In the course of all your reading for this degree, you are going to encounter some impenetrable writing. You are going to struggle to understand the poor writing of some academic texts you need to read. We don't want you to try and replicate this. And one of the reasons we encourage you not to do this stems from Albert Einstein's quote below. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. From both of these quotes, there are a few ideas to adopt in your writing. Firstly, keep it simple. But this doesn't mean that you stay away from the complex ideas. Connected to this, the ideas you will be studying and developing in your writing will be complex already. You don't need to add more complexity through impenetrable writing. But this does not mean don't go into detail. Finally, a basic rule about when you should use specialist vocabulary might go as follows. Use new words only once they become familiar enough to do so without thinking. This means expanding your vocabulary comes from your broader reading. The next point to consider comes in the form of a quote from 18th century Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. If I had had more time, this letter would have been shorter. Very briefly, this boils down to a very simple piece of advice, which is that you can usually say what you want to say in fewer words. Again, I'll draw upon a witty comic, this time Peanuts, where Snoopy is trying to be a writer, typing out, "Those years in Paris were among the finest of her life." Looking back, she once remarked, "Those years in Paris were among the finest of my life." That is what she said when she looked back upon those years in Paris, where she spent some of the finest years of her life. Snoopy then stops, looks to the audience and admits, "I think this is going to need a little editing." From a student's perspective, here is an example of a student's earlier draft. I will read this out, but you might want to pause the video to read this extract a couple more times. Keep an eye open for repetition. Labeling theory and the social construction of crime may help with understanding what makes a person deemed dangerous. Newbern suggests social construction of crime and the labels which are given to those committing criminal acts are set by the society and how social norms around behavior are interpreted. It provides a label to the offender by society, a definition of what they are by their offence behavior. Did you spot any repetitive elements in the paragraph? They are perhaps not as obvious as Snoopy's attempts at writing, but they are there. Let's take a look at those elements highlighted. Obviously the phrase social construction of crime appears twice, but we also have two lines. Labels which are given to those committing criminal acts are set by the society, and provides a label to the offender by society. This is the same idea being presented twice, and when becoming more aware of this, we can start editing it out. For example, labeling theory and the social construction of crime contribute to the idea of dangerousness of offenders. Newbern suggests that crime is defined and thus constructed by society. As a result, criminals are defined as dangerous based on society's interpretation of their behavior. This, with a little more work, could be further refined to: Newbern suggests that crime is defined or constructed by society, and thus criminals undergo labeling based on how society interprets their behavior. At this point, I will address a situation that almost everyone watching this video is going to encounter at some point during their degree. The situation is as follows. The essay you needed to write was 2,000 words plus or minus 10%. You submitted on time, but struggled to get the word count down to the maximum accepted word count of 2,200 words. You then receive feedback saying things like, "You could have talked more about A," or "You needed to include more about B." And you'll be thinking, how? I had no more words to play with. Hopefully from this example you now see that while the original text had 67 words, the more concise version only has 22. This means that 2/3 of the text could be removed without removing any of the ideas. So returning to Voltaire's point, it is worth giving yourself the time to redraft so you can write more efficiently and concisely. Reaching the word count is an easy target to set yourself, but if you want the essay to be any good, you need to remember that you won't be rewarded by using 20 words to explain a 10-word idea. Connected to this, and this is far easier advice to give than to follow, I admit, is a very famous quote from Faulkner, a fiction writer and Nobel Prize laureate. He said, "In writing, you must kill your darlings." When I presented this at the induction, a few students suggested this might refer to abandoning one's own ideas and sticking to what you've read. This is a valid interpretation that I hadn't considered. However, the reason I chose this quote was that, from experience, I know that you can spend hours, even days, reading a source, taking ideas from it, and even writing early drafts of paragraphs that summarize and discuss it. You might even be very proud of the work you have done with this source and that writing. However, ultimately, you need the courage and discipline once you take the writer's hat off and put the editor's hat on to get rid of writing that is not relevant to the assessment question you are being asked to respond to. We will cover editing a little more later on, but suffice to say, be prepared to review your work with a critical eye. Compare the sentences you write with the broader themes of your assignment. Do they fit? And remember that the amount of work you put into a sentence doesn't mean it belongs in the final draft. Zadie Smith's advice on writing is perhaps the most difficult to follow. Protect the time and space in which you write. Keep everybody away from it, even the people who are most important to you. This speaks again to the discipline that will be required of you as you go through your degree. Ultimately, you've chosen to do this degree, and you need to respect that choice and give it its due attention. This becomes much easier if those you regularly interact with can also understand the need for you to protect a certain amount of time and space for you to get on uninterrupted with your studies. And finally, from Stephen King, who I'm sure needs no introduction, comes a more positive note to finish our list of quotes. The scariest moment is always just before you start. After that, things can only get better. So from this, we can take the advice not to leave it too long before you start writing. From my own experience, it is invariably easier to improve upon bad writing than to get the writing down in the first place. Here are a few top tips for students wishing to put their best foot forward with their academic writing. Pay attention to the reading list. Avoid it at your peril. The reading list has been built by the same lecturer who has designed the module, the same lecturer who has set the assignment questions. This means the texts on the reading list, while not an exhaustive list of important key texts, are not texts you should ignore. However, keep in mind that if there is a multiple choice element as to which assignment question you choose, then the reading list will attempt to provide key texts for all topics, so there will be some sources that won't necessarily be relevant to you. Please don't see the list as something that should be completely read from first source to last. One small tip: print off the question and stick it up where you plan to do most of your studying. This keeps you visually aware of the question and thus makes it less likely that you will go off on a tangent. Also, highlighting things is practically useless compared to engaging your brain and writing notes. Highlighting is too passive to help you actually learn anything you are reading. It simply makes it easier to find the information again, when actually what you really want to be doing is aiming to absorb, process, and understand what you've read. One technique that works well for some students is to write notes for each chapter or article, as though you're preparing a quick 2-minute presentation summarizing what you've read. As you will have noted, I'm strongly encouraging the writing of notes, but for these to be effective, you will need to use these notes. The more you use them, the better and more useful they become. Also, keep all of your notes in the same place. Don't give yourself more work by trying to remember what notes are kept where. More broadly speaking, try to keep a growth mindset. The opposite of this is a fixed mindset. Someone with a fixed mindset might say, "I'm just not any good at academic writing," whereas someone with a growth mindset would say, "I'm not good at academic writing yet." Keep in mind that this is the beginning of your course of study, and you are going to grow in knowledge and skills enormously, so that when you do finally need to produce a 10,000-word dissertation, you won't be the same student who is watching this guidance right now. And finally, stay in touch. Distance learning can be lonely, and a small problem unaddressed can lead to days, even weeks of inaction. If you are struggling, let someone know. There are a number of pieces of guidance material available on my Moodle page, which I'm showing you a small selection here in the video. As you can see, most of them are step-by-step instructions that you can apply to completed or more or less completed drafts. And I want to just finish by showing you a few common student errors and trying to nip these in the bud before they become issues for you. So the first one is what you can see here, which is, I don't know really what to call them, I suppose half paragraphs, where a new sentence has started a new line but there's no space between the paragraphs. This isn't a thing. Either the text needs to be divided into 2 separate paragraphs, in which case there should be a space between those 2 paragraphs, or the sentence should follow on from the previous sentence on the same line. One of the biggest issues that students have is not citing the sources not backing up what they are saying with evidence. So for example, in the example you see in front of you, we have nowadays bureaucracy is linked with overload, policies and procedures. How do we know this? What evidence is there that this is the case? These are the sorts of things that the marker will be thinking about and will be asking you in the comments if there aren't citations showing where you've gained this knowledge from. Continuing for a moment longer. In policing, bureaucracy is described as... Now, just stop right there. If something is described, then somebody described it that way, in which case you need to provide a citation that acknowledges who described the thing in that way. Another common error that I see in a lot of work that students send me is that they haven't actually used the spelling and grammar and syntax checks and warnings that Microsoft Word has been showing them. So I opened this piece of work up from a student, and as we can see, there are some rather obvious spelling mistakes and a few grammar issues that are being underlined with red or green or sometimes blue lines. Now, these need to be dealt with as and when they appear. You can't leave them to the end. While I don't understand the algorithm myself, what I do note is that Microsoft Word won't show all of the mistakes if there are a great number of them. It will only show some percentage or some specific number of them. I don't know what percentage or what number. But in a way, basically what it's saying is if you're not paying attention to the warnings it's giving, it will stop giving those warnings. So if you do have a document that's got a lot of these sorts of mistakes, when you do right-click, deal with the issue, fix the spelling, fix the grammar, fix the syntax, whatever, and you go through the entire document and do this, you will probably need to save the document, close it, and open it again. And then it's possible that other mistakes will then reveal themselves. One other thing to do is maybe once you've done that, open it on a different computer just to get a fresh look at the document. For some reason, some students will say, I didn't see any of these errors, but when they open them on a university computer, for example, they will suddenly have all of these red and green and blue lines. And finally, I just wanted to show you what plagiarism looks like to the markers. What you see highlighted in red there matches exactly with another source. As we can see, there are a few words that have been changed, so or, forced, the, employees, behavior, but Turnitin, which you will need to submit all of your work through, will still spots the overall structure as being something that is familiar, and most of the words as being similar. If the marker sees that, they will likely put a note in about possible plagiarism, and at the very least they will be encouraging you to come and see me to discuss and improve skills around paraphrasing. Anyway, I hope that you found this guidance video somewhat helpful. As I said, my name is Gordon Scruton. You can contact me by email at gordon.scruton@port.ac.uk, or my number is 02392 845 743, and good luck with your studies.